Good evening, Father Murr.
Good evening, Robert. Greetings to you.
Thank you.
I've got the sun. I've got the rays of the sun, the afternoon sun, right in my face. It'll pass in just a minute, but go ahead.
All right, this is one of our perhaps most important conversations. We're going to discuss Malachi Martin, and it's important because he is a figure who incarnates the concern of Catholics that something has happened to the Catholic Church in the transitional period after the Second Vatican Council. And we want to understand what has happened to the church. And Malachi Martin is a figure who helps us do that. We have one of our viewers, Joseph Internicola. I've always found Malachi Martin very intriguing. I was not really sure where he stood in terms of his status in the church. We're going to try to go into all these questions. And Father, you knew Malachi Martin. I spoke with him myself on the telephone, actually right after the commandant of the Swiss Guard was killed by gunfire and his wife in May of 1998. And I found Malachi's number and called him, and he said the Pope's in a very difficult position. And we talked for some minutes, and he appreciated the writing that I was doing in the magazine Inside the Vatican. Right. I'm the editor. And you have followed all the twists and turns of the life of the church.
When I was a pastor in New York City of 3 different parishes. And at one point, I contacted, through a friend of mine, I contacted Malachi Martin. He was incredibly open to meeting with me. And not only did we meet, but oftentimes we had dinner together at the Capri restaurant. I think it's on 68th and Lexington or something like that.
Oh, very nice.
That was his hangout. And he was very open in discussion. No secrets. This conversation flowed very well. A brilliant man, a raconteur par excellence, and very entertaining always. And to tell you the truth, Robert, he was the one who convinced me to start writing. And when I gave him the outline for my first story, which is now being rewritten, he said he found it so intriguing, sensational actually was the word he used, that if I didn't write it, he was going to write it. If he wanted my permission to write it himself. I said, no, I'll write it. Anyway, he was very encouraging. And I found him just very insightful and a good man, a very good man.
Okay, so Malachi Martin was born in 1921. He died in 1999. He lived to be 78 years old. He was born in Ireland in County Kerry. He was born in a family of 10 children. I think last week I had the wrong number. And there were 5 boys and 5 girls. And the brothers of Malachi Martin, all four of his brothers became priests. So we're talking about a family that in the 1920s, 1930s, in Ireland was as traditionally Catholic as it could possibly be. And he himself started and he was a brilliant young scholar. And in the 40s, he was studying Semitic languages, and he got over to the continent. And here's the kind of summary that by the time of 1954, he had finished his studies. He had been in the Jesuit order as a student, and in August 1954, he was ordained a Jesuit priest.
Robert, let me just interrupt at this point. Malachi Martin was brilliant. I mean, there was no question about it. Foreign languages and ancient languages, theology, philosophy, but there was no arrogance about him. I know people who have taken a philosophy course and all of a sudden they're arrogant. They know everything. Mm-hmm. Malachi wasn't that way at all. He was very down to earth, but but he had every, let me just put it this way, he had every right to be proud. He didn't show
Yeah.
pride.
Yes. Okay, so we're not gonna actually try to judge in any way the soul of Malachi Martin. And there are many who think of him as a saint, almost a prophet. There's others who think that he was somehow deceptive and mixed fact and fiction and don't have a high opinion of him. That must be stated for the record. Some people feel that he was type of a fraud. There are people who feel that way. But we're going to try to analyze his importance for entering into the deep questions of the post-conciliar collapse of the Catholic Church and giving an explanation for that collapse in a type of infiltration of the church by traitors, by non-Catholic thinking, by modernists. And that is the subject of the later books in his career, which were not historical books, but novels, Windswept House perhaps being the most prominent.
His style of writing, he called faction. And it's an interesting combination of fact, historical fact, and fiction. He tried to put historical fact in the context of a story that was engaging, and I found it more than engaging. It was engaging. It was also insightful. It was educational. He brought in things that were actually happening and that had happened, and put them in a novel form. That's all.
Right. So there's so much material here that even this hour-long conversation will be insufficient to go through. But what we must ask is the mentality of considering the church to be infiltrated and the Vatican to be under the pressure of forces that are not Catholic, not Orthodox,
Right.
is perhaps the central contribution of his effort. But why this is fascinating is that as a very young priest, he was certainly conservative. But then as the 60s come along, he seems to be participating at the Second Vatican Council, and then in the post-conciliar period, having asked in 1964 to be laicized, no longer being a priest, he's become quite liberal into the early 1970s.
I would interrupt here, Robert, to clarify that just a little bit. Anyway, from what I know of him, and I think I know enough of him to be able to say this. It wasn't a question of liberal or conservative, Orthodox, unorthodox. It was more a question of the confusion of those times.
Okay.
I've tried to put it before that going into the Second Vatican Council, everyone went in with a certain excitement. Actually, it was because it was very promising. Nobody went into the Second Vatican Council that I've met. None of the bishops that I've ever met who were there, who participated, went in with a sense of dread. They really didn't. Even the conservatives, I mean, that we consider conservative, there was a freshness about it. Let's see what things had to be updated, what have you. That was what they went in with. What it ended up being was something else. And that's when a lot of confusion entered into a lot of people's minds. And we had this great mass exit of priestly vocations to the religious life. I told you from 1965 to 1975, we lost 500,000 teaching sisters and nursing sisters. And this is 500,000. Jesuits were 30,000. We lost 10,000 Jesuits. So what I'm trying to say is what Malachi Martin went through was this period of confusion.
Yeah.
And it seemed like the bottom was dropping out of everything. So
Right.
I have patience for him during that time.
Okay. Well, let's go back to his timeline and just give people a clear sense of what he was doing and was responsible for. Can we look at the biography line? He's ordained in 1954. This is still the period of Pius XII, and Father Murr, you knew very well the secretary of Pius XII. So in
Mother
some way,
Pasqualini very well. Yes.
Mother Pasqualina, you've written a book about her, and you used to see her once every few weeks in Rome for a couple of
I
years
did.
in the 1970s, a fascinating aspect of your life. So,
And very fascinating woman.
yeah. So Martin is this young Semitic languages genius. He had even studied in Jerusalem, in Beirut, and he's back in Rome. He's ordained a Jesuit. There's a couple of years here, 54 to 58, where it's not absolutely clear what he's doing. And there are reports that he even received a type of intelligence mission or special commission by Pius XII to go behind the Iron Curtain and try to support and resuscitate the Catholic Church in the Soviet Union. There are reports of that. I don't know their truth. There's apparently a picture. I just watched an interview with a man who's preparing a definitive biography on Malachi Martin. Apparently, there's a picture of him that suggests that it was true, that he was actually in Russia in about 1957. In any case, in 58, he's back in Rome and he becomes a key figure. Well, actually, I'd like to, he works, yes, here it is, Cardinal Augustin Bea, who is a key figure in the Vatican. He's a German cardinal. He's close to Pope Pius XII.
And the Jesuit. And the
And
Jesuit.
the Jesuit. We perhaps should have put SJ there. And the Jesuit cardinal brings in this young priest who, born in 1921, in 1958, he would have been 37 years old. 37. And when you're 37, you're certainly a man, but you're still young. And Malachi is suddenly at the heart of the Vatican. So there's no doubt that he became a Vatican insider. And he's working just two steps away from Pope Pius XII. And then immediately in 58, Pius XII passes away and John the 23rd is elected. And immediately in early 1959, John says, I'm going to call an ecumenical council. Now, part of the dossier of Bea was dealing with relations with the Jews, with Judaism. And because Malachi Martin was his secretary, he knew everything that Bea was working on. Every paper crossed his desk. And in the council, among the other things they wanted to deal with, updating the church, they also wanted to have better relations with Protestants in general, to try to reunite with Protestants, and with Jews who had just passed through the terrible persecution of the Second World War. And Malachi Martin, let's go back to the timeline. Malachi Martin is there in 1960 and 61 as they start to decide what documents they want to prepare for the council. They write them up inside Vatican City. And 1962, they start the council, and Malachi is there meeting with thousands of journalists who come to Rome, and also leading members of the world Jewish community as they meet with his boss, Cardinal Bea, and they try to decide what the church is going to say about its relationship with Judaism. And in this process, Malachi becomes a friend of Robert Blair Kaiser. We have his picture here. Robert Blair Kaiser. He was the this is Robert Blair Kaiser. And he was born in 1931. He died in 2015. I spent most of a day with him in 2002 in Rome, talking about his life, his work in Rome. He was the correspondent for Time in the first session of the council, 1962. And he told me he was a close friend of Malachi Martin. And he also told me that he ended up not any longer being a friend of Malachi because there was a difficulty between he, Malachi, and Robert's wife, Susan. And he wrote a book. Robert Blair Kaiser wrote a book saying that Malachi had a relationship with his wife, and that book came out in 2002, and it's called Clerical Error. This is a accusation against Malachi, and what we do know is that Robert Blair Kaiser received all sorts of information for his articles from Malachi, had him present at all the dinner parties that he and his wife put on with $20,000 a month from Time Magazine to influence the Vatican Council in a secular direction. But that Robert Blair Kaiser then had a breakdown, left covering the council, and Malachi Martin decided in '64 also to leave the priesthood, asked to be laicized. You have any comment on that?
I guess so. I don't believe that. I don't believe that the story of the affair between Malachi Martin and Kaiser's wife. I don't believe it. I don't believe it at all. As a matter of fact, as you mentioned the last time, Kaiser, who was a former Jesuit also.
Yeah.
All right. He left the Society of Jesus and married. He also had a nervous breakdown, and I believe, I may be wrong on this, but I don't think I am. I think he was diagnosed schizophrenic, which would have an awful lot a lot of bearing on that book that he wrote. It was a scandalous book when it came out. It was shocking, and I remember being with Jesuits who read the book, and they weren't buying it either. Okay, anyway, the group of Jesuits that I knew from the Gregorian, who knew both Malachi Martin and Kaiser. Kaiser is not his real name. I forget what his real name is. But anyway,
actually, I never knew that.
Yes, yeah, it's he changed his name to Kaiser because he was they had nickname. He had an odd name, and then they received a lot of nicknames from his classmates and the Jesuits. So he finally arrived the day that he changed it to Kaiser. But anyway, he was. I think he had suffered a nervous breakdown.
Yes,
and
I think he did.
So I don't think that. I mean, take it with a grain of salt.
Okay.
The book, and there actually was no real reason to write that book. There just wasn't. There wasn't. I don't know what he was trying to justify, even if something had happened. Also, he did get a tremendous amount of his information, the scuttlebutt we used to call it, from Malachi Martin. Malachi was certainly one of the people inside the Vatican who knew everybody and everyone and everything, and so the Kaiser depended an awful lot on him, and that was the closeness of the relationship. Anyway, I don't believe that there was something going on. I don't believe that I did not read the book, however. I refused to read it.
All right. Well, the fact is that neither Kaiser nor Malachi were present at the last session of the Vatican Council in 1965, and the council came to an end, and then we come to what we call the post-conciliar period, where the Church tries to digest and implement the Second Vatican Council, and we may say that period is still continuing today in 2024. And this is nearly it's 60 years later from those times. You and I were little boys at that time, and other people were present at the council, and Cardinal Ratzinger was a young man there, more or less the same age as these men. And
you, Robert, were a little boy. I was 15. I was 15, and I had parents. Both my mother and father were very involved in discussion groups organized by a great parish priest that we had, Father Schoenberger, a good theologian and a solid man, also trained in Germany. they had discussion groups, and there was a lot of reading. I remember my parents both read the Dutch Catechism. Could you imagine such a thing? As soon as
Yeah.
it came out
Well,
for discussion.
for our readers,
Yeah.
I mean, not our readers, our viewers, what would you summarize as was the
Well,
Dutch
the Dutch Catechism was a catechism put together by the Dutch bishops, and it was very unorthodox, is putting it lightly. If I had been Pope, I would have condemned it. But anyway, it was the newest thing out, and so my parents were very involved in things that were coming out of the Vatican, things that were new to the world of religion. They ultimately kept their old faith because they saw the weakness of where things were going. But at the beginning, it's like I was trying to say at the beginning, everyone was hopeful. This was new air, a breath of new air coming into the church, and people were hopeful. Then they started seeing that it was not all that it was trumped up to be. Anyway, let me just put it that way.
Okay.
But there was during that whole period, this is when so many people had crises of vocation and this and the other, but also not just priests and nuns. Let me say this, Robert. And I went to high school we had the Christian Brothers at that time, the French Christian Brothers, and the Sisters of St. Joseph. They went through their crisis of vocation, each one of them, and took us along for the ride.
Yes.
All right? Because everything that we learned in grade school, 8 years of Catholic grade school, which was fabulous knowledge, and it was really theology that we were taught in a very serious manner. Everything was debunked in the 4 years of high school that I went through. And so what I'm saying, these men and women went through their own crisis of vocation, but they took all of us with them. And so many people, so many lay people, so many of my classmates, even today, have just lost the faith completely. All right. This was the time, that time of chaos that has never really gone away. It's never finished yet, unfortunately.
Okay.
All right.
I agree with that, and I myself have struggled to kind of find a balance between being a human being in the modern world and between carrying forward the faith of the church from 20 centuries. And Malachi Martin, I'm sure, was in that same vortex. And I'd like to go back to the the timeline of his life here. After the council, he suddenly shows up in America, and he's living in New York City, and he's got various jobs, including driving a taxi. This is a man who had been a PhD in archaeology and Oriental history and Semitic languages, 3 PhDs. And so from the period of 64 up to 1989, when his priestly faculties were restored, he is functioning as a writer where he's brilliant. And he's first writing books that are a little bit, you might say, in tune with the times, a little bit progressive. And then suddenly he himself seems to realize how far astray the church has gone.
That's right. That's a good take on it, Robert. Yes.
Yeah, and maybe he thought that some things in his personal life had gone astray too. I'm not sure, but certainly and people might say he has a special commission to act underground, undercover. Other people might say no, he simply was going through his own midlife crisis.
I disagree that he was underground, undercover, this, that, and the other. I think what he went through was his own crisis of vocation. I really believe that. And I think that the reason that he went to New York was to get away from all of that, from the Vatican, from philosophy, theology, ecclesiology, everything that smelt of incense, and start over. He was going to give himself a new beginning. You don't, and this was a deep commitment to that, Robert. You don't walk away from 3 PhDs in such classic studies just on a fluke. He gave a lot of thought to it, I'm sure.
Yeah,
went to New York looking for a new beginning, and then rediscovered his own Catholic roots deeper, deeper, deeper. And that's where a real maturation and a spiritual maturation happened in him. That's what I believe happened. And I'm taking from bits and pieces of what we talked about over the years.
Well, it would make
back and forth.
It would make sense. He's now in the 1970s, and he's trying to understand what's happened to the Roman Catholic Church, the Church of Jesus Christ, which seems in crisis. And Paul VI, on June 29th, Feast of Peter and Paul in 1972 is when it was. He says, it was after the council we thought we would have springtime weather and breezes and sunshine, but we actually came into turbulent times, dark clouds, as if by some fissure in the walls of the church, the smoke of Satan, or the smoke of Satan had entered, the smoke of the devil had entered into the sanctuary of God, had entered into the church. That became more or less the hermeneutic that Malachi Martin began to pursue. That by some fissure, after all the hope that the church would reform and become modern and up to date, something had come in to undermine that, which Paul VI himself said had become widely believed, that there's something had gone wrong. How could this have happened? How could so many people have lost?
Well, there's no question that happened to Paul VI. Mm-hmm. I saw it happen in the 70s. He became more and more defensive and withdrawn, and on occasions, and especially toward the end of his life, almost not a depression in a clinical sense of the word, but a lack of enthusiasm about life, about many things. He was strongly criticized by his clergy, priests and bishops, and he took that very much to heart.
Yeah.
You know, Robert, that when somebody writes in and they criticize you for a program or for something that you said, and people can be very unkind, it can hurt you if you let it. You can slough it off and just get on to the next thing, which is what I've tried to do all of my life.
Well, there you go.
We all try to do. Well, we pay no attention to it, just get on. Yeah. But Paul VI did pay attention to all of the criticism. And after Humanae Vitae in 1968, he took that rejection of Humanae Vitae very personally.
Yes.
And this was really, you could see there was a certain anguish in him, and there was an anguish in the church. As the Pope is, so is the church. I've seen it happen. I see it today. Yeah. I see it happening today. So this is what Malachi saw. Also, something not to be forgotten. In 1964, he was seeing the bottom fall out of the Jesuits. So this wasn't just the Catholic Church in a generic sense, in a wide sense. It hit home. The Jesuit order was falling apart, and he saw that. He saw the beginnings of it. He saw the division, he saw the conflicts, he saw it. And he wanted no part of it. And he retreated to start a new life. Right. Then he woke up to the reality, as you're saying.
Right, and then now the themes come in that I just simply, and I apologize if we're not proceeding quickly enough, trying to give you some insight into the figure of Malachi Martin. In the 1970s and 80s, he started to write his famous books, and the themes that he took up were the great themes that still concern us today, and including question of the devil's role, exorcism. He wrote a couple of books about exorcism, and he was in fact consulted, I believe, with regard to the famous film The Exorcist. Those are the Hostage to the Devil, 1976. Yes. And that book Jesus Now in 1973 is still a rather modernistic book, and Three Popes and the Cardinal, that was that was Pius XII, John the 23rd, Paul the Sixth, and Cardinal Bea, and he's talking about his own personal experience. The decline and fall of the Roman Church, he's starting to really try to explain what factors have caused this house of God, this church of 2,000 years, to kind of crumble, to be uncertain, to be divided into progressive and conservative factions. It's as if the gutters are filled with leaves and termites have come into some of the foundations, and he's trying to analyze why all that has happened on the basis of his tremendous inside experience from those years when he was very close to John the 23rd and to other officials in the Vatican. And so, and then suddenly he comes to the conclusion that a fictional treatment of these matters and a depiction of an infiltration into the church of a humanistic thought, we might call it globalism today, which wants to not so much destroy everything about the Catholic Church, but simply take over the levers of the Catholic Church and make the church a partner in a global agenda, which involves, first of all, in those years in the 80s, the Soviet Union still existed. So he's seeing communism as a kind of as it was, an atheistic system that tries to eliminate God from the horizon of human life. And then in the 90s, he starts to see that even after that system, there is a globalism which is trying to go beyond God. We might go beyond good and evil, which we are still experiencing today. And that's why Malachi's books are a kind of analysis of the infiltration of this thought and of actual agents of this thought into the structure and hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church. And in that sense, he's kind of following the Gagnon trail, where he was trying to investigate how that was happening already in the 1970s.
I think what you're saying, Robert, is what I've been trying to say also. Malachi's writing is his own personal struggle to come to knowledge of what was happening. Malachi Martin was a very intelligent and very deep human being. And he struggled a lot to try to understand what was happening to the church. He took a few different directions in that search. Ultimately, he understood what it was, and he really truly believed that it was diabolical, that what was happening to the church was diabolical. And that's the word I've heard him use. He used it in my company, talking about what was happening to the church's present and future, and he was very concerned with it. I think he was deeply in love with the church toward the end of his life. Whatever shook him up in those years in his 30s, those critical years during and after the council, was laid to rest. He came into his own. And he started writing his books, as you mentioned, talking about real facts, but putting them in a way that they could be digested by people in the form of novel. Right? Okay. But all of his writings are his own struggle. They're his own struggle, and they're evident in reading them.
Now there is a problem. Okay, let's read Joan Dennis's comment. Father Malachi liked JP too, but later became very disappointed in him.
True. That's true.
Well, I mean, okay, Lawrence Marton, Father Vincent O'Keefe, I knew Father Vincent, a vicar general of the Jesuits, stated that Father Martin was dispensed from his vows of poverty and obedience, but not chastity. Father Martin remained a valid priest all of his life.
Yeah, I would. First of all, I would like to see where Father O'Keefe wrote that. If that could be documented for me, I'd like to read that. I've never heard of such a thing happening. I do know that Malachi considered himself a priest, and I do know that he offered mass, if not daily, certainly regularly. So
Mhm.
he remained a priest. He understood that when a man was ordained a priest, he was a priest for the rest of his life. He again, he went through his own crisis with all of that and came to that conclusion. So
Yeah.
I congratulate him for that. It was very.
And I guess,
He went through tough times. I mean, I'm just saying that people don't understand the struggle that so many priests and religious went through during those times. The carpet was pulled out from underneath so many of us. You know, it's amazing
here,
that anyone survived.
okay, I think that's important that we recognize the crisis, and we still face it today. So I think we should be kind of somehow supportive of each other. And if we make some mistakes and we're sort of short-sighted, we'll try to enlighten each other as best we can, based on reason, study, and goodwill. This is our tradition as Catholics. Jacqueline Yoshinari writes, my introduction to Malachi Martin was his 1973 book, Jesus Now. I was a young convert of 5 years and concluded that he had lost his faith. That's what I said. The book was a little bit more modern. But Malachi certainly touched on the great issues of the liturgy. He became ever more persuaded something had gone wrong in the liturgical reform, and we'd lost a sense of the sacred. He became interested in the secret of Fatima and the question of whether we have a question for you here. Sandra Houston, Father Murr, do you believe the Novus Ordo, N-O, Novus Ordo, New Order of the Liturgy, is valid? Well,
I believe it's valid. Yes, I do. I believe that so many of the Novus Ordo masses are illicit, but valid. And I'll tell you one of the things, speaking of that, and it's a great question. Thank you for it. Malachi Martin told me the following, and it was amazing because both he and Monsignor Mario Marini said the exact same thing. And it was this.
Yes.
And Malachi actually wrote it. I have a letter from him where he wrote it. He wrote to me in Austria, and he said, "Remember when you say Mass." I think we had discussed this, but he said,
Yes.
"Remember when you say Mass, to say when you're vesting, that when you say for all men in the consecration of the body and blood of Christ." This is my body. This is the chalice of my blood shed for all. Before you begin Mass, say that when you say for all, you mean for many. Now that was curious because Monsignor Mario Marini told me the exact same thing when I was preparing for ordination. He said that it has to be changed. It was fine in Latin. It was always pro multis, but he said if you're going to say Mass in Italian or Spanish or English, remember to say when you say for all, you mean for many. And actually, Mario Marini, who said the same thing that Malachi Martin said, exact same thing, Monsignor Marini was the one who actually had that changed. Finally, he pushed for that to be changed, and the language came back into what it is today. Many priests refuse to accept that change and still say in the consecration for all men, and that is incorrect. So do I believe it's valid? Yes, I believe it's valid. I believe also that it's illicitly celebrated in many cases.
Yes. Well, Malachi became very interested in this liturgical question. Okay, Chris H. asks, I am listening with a delay, and maybe someone clarified that Urbi et Orbi Communications, Malachi Martin, was never laicized. He was secularized instead, the difference being he had priestly faculties. That, Father.
Well, one thing is to be out of vows as a religious, poverty, chastity, and obedience. There are two kinds of priests. I don't want to get into the weeds so much, but if I do, Robert, you pull me out, okay? There are
Yeah.
two kinds of priests. There is a diocesan priest who belongs to the bishop of a diocese. He belongs to a place. There is a religious priest who belongs to a community. For
Like
example,
like
the Jesuits, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, et cetera, the Salesians. Those are community priests, religious priests. In canon law and in the standing of the church, the religious has a superior vocation to that of the diocesan priest. His vocation is superior. If I wanted to leave the diocese to become a religious, that would be easy to do. If I were a religious and wanted to become a diocesan priest, that would be harder to do because I'm going down in category, right? The religious take 3 vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. The diocesan priest does not take poverty. He takes obedience to his superior, his bishop, and chastity. Now, that means that the diocesan priest can own his own home, his own car, his own business if he wants to. I mean, if his bishop permits it. But the religious priest not. So when you're saying that Malachi Martin became secularized, you're saying that he became a diocesan priest. Well, he didn't become a diocesan priest.
No, he never was. No.
Well, otherwise he would belong to a bishop who would be giving him his orders. But he left the Society of Jesus. He left the Jesuit priest, the Jesuit community, and that to me was his crisis. That was his crisis, his personal crisis. Everybody goes through a crisis in life. Everybody, whether you're married or not married, in any life there's crisis, and that's a motive for a new growth. Malachi went through his, and it lasted for a few years, until he took all of what he knew and became a new person with more conviction about what he was. There was more of a mission in his life. He never stopped being a priest. Let me just put that way.
All right. I understand. I think that's a good answer. Never stopped being a priest, but he had left the Jesuits, which was the
yes.
The whole.
And I think that was his problem. His problem wasn't with the priesthood. His problem was with the Jesuits.
Okay. We have another question. Father Murr, do you believe the language of all and many invalidate the consecration? Because in the Latin it says pro multis, which literally means for many.
Yes. Look, here's the thing.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. You cannot change the words of our Lord. You don't change what Christ said.
Right.
Well, we'd like it to say for all men, for all mankind, because that's more inclusive and people feel better that way. Well, I don't care how people feel. That's not what Christ said. He didn't say that. So this was a real problem for a lot of people. And finally, quietly, the Vatican came to terms with that too and insisted that it be changed in all languages back to the many, right? So it's, I don't know that, I don't know. If you're asking me, do I believe that it invalidates the sacrament? I don't know. I would say this. I think most priests had the intention of offering the sacrifice of the Mass correctly. Their intention was to consecrate the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. Therefore, yes, but there's also a thing, you have to use the right words to it. It's kind of a complicated mess. I've always tried to stay on the right side of it, and I'm very glad that it was finally addressed and put to rest.
I mean, we might say people wanted a kind of universalism inserted there, and they made the argument that Jesus himself had intended that. And these were these French theologians say, la multitude, the multitude means everyone in the crowd. So they said, let's take the pro multis, which was used for hundreds of years in the Latin Mass, And when we translate it into German or into English, let's say this is being offered for the salvation of everyone, of all. And they said because it really was what Jesus meant. But then the Vatican finally understood that this was distorting Jesus's meaning. And
Yeah,
turned it
what
back.
actually what they said, Robert, was more. It was a little bit different than that. What they were saying was when our Lord said, "Take and eat. This is my body shed. This is my blood, my body and my blood shed for you and for the many." Well, what the theologians who were universalists, they wanted this for everybody. Everybody's saved. We get into that whole thing right now. Everybody's saved. Nobody's going to hell. There is no hell, right? We get into all of this nonsense when you start overlooking the seriousness of God's word. But what they decided that Christ said, they decided what Christ said. Let me put it clearly. This is my blood shed for you, the 12,
Yes.
and for the rest. So the rest, or the multitude, the many, and you are all. All right. Well, that's not what Christ said. That's not what he said. And it's very clear that they were playing games with that, as they've been playing games with the liturgy for 60 years.
Yeah. Well, just back to Martin then. Our subject, Father Malachi Martin, S.J., who died in 1999, 25 years ago this summer. So he became fascinated by this question of how the church could pass through this period of, you might call it apostasy, like a modernism. He would write these books and show that systematic apostasy was occurring in the hierarchy, and the church was trying to compromise for the sake of a vision of a united humanity, was trying to compromise the truth of Christ. And so you would read a book like Windswept House, and he would give different names to the cardinals and to the archbishops. And someone like myself, I'd read the book and say, well, I know that man and this man. He's quoting him more or less exactly what he said, like Cardinal Casaroli, for example. But he didn't call him Casaroli. And then Malachi was then opening the eyes of a large readership to the complexity and cross currents of the Vatican's Ostpolitik, its negotiations with the communists, and then later its negotiations with the European Union, now with the globalists, which we face again today. So it was the injection into the consciousness of many thousands, tens of thousands of Catholics, of a mentality that was different from the mentality that we had prior to the council. We were very subservient and obedient and trusting. But Malachi was telling us, I have insights into the struggles that are occurring, and I'm revealing to you that there's strong financial, intellectual, political, and even satanic powers that are trying in every way, through every crack, to influence the leadership of the church, to affect its teaching. And he put that into his books. And wouldn't you say that it finally becomes the mission that was entrusted to Malachi that he carried out?
Yes. No, there's no doubt. There's no doubt. What he wanted to do was he wanted Catholics, especially, anybody, but he certainly wanted Catholics to wake up, because something was happening in the church that we are seeing clearly today, I might add. Clearly, we're seeing it today. That might not have been so clear 25 years ago.
Well,
but it is clear. It is clear today. It is clear today. In that sense, he was certainly a prophet. He was certainly a prophet.
Yeah. Just Mimi's writing greetings from New York and Flying Tigers. If Reverend Dr. Martin did have intelligence contacts, would he have revealed them willy-nilly to Father Murr?
No, he would not have revealed them willy-nilly to Father Murr. No. But I think in our relationship, he would have mentioned that he had them. Okay.
Mhm.
He would have mentioned, and I simply don't recall him mentioning, and I would have remembered something like that. He may have
But
had them. I
but
don't know.
in his analysis of the direction we're taking, I think if we were to summarize, he would have said, let's return to Christ and let's not be seduced by the world, which is seductive, and it praises us on the one hand, denounces us on the other, left punch, right punch, and it gives us the option of getting a Nobel Prize or a scholarship or a foundation grant on the one hand, and of Xing us out and excluding us if we keep the profound Orthodox faith. And they depict it as small-minded, narrow-minded, retrograde. And he said, in this battle, let's keep focused on Christ. I think that was the central message.
Yes, yeah. He was saying that a false Christ was being presented,
Yes.
was being presented gradually in the church, and he also remarked, and I agreed with him completely, and we were in agreement on most everything, that the church and the world were becoming a little bit too friendly.
Well,
He would flip if he could see what has become of the church and the world, their relationship today,
you know,
because they're on the same side. They're on the same side.
this reminds me also of this Tychonius factor. Tychonius was a theologian at the time of St. Augustine. He was actually a Donatist, but St. Augustine read and appreciated. The Donatists were in schism from the Church of Rome, but they were profoundly Christian, profoundly committed to Christ. And
The
Tychonius,
Donatists, the Donatists basically said this: the validity of a sacrament depended on the sanctity of the priest.
mm,
That was
yeah,
that was their error. If the
yeah,
priest wasn't holy and in the state of grace, there was no valid consecration. There was no valid anything.
yeah. It
Right?
was also, I think it was also that they were emerging at the time the persecutions were ending. And when some priests had yielded to the request to burn incense to Caesar, the Donatists said, "Oh no, they've yielded to worldliness. They've yielded to faith. They've betrayed the faith," and they didn't forgive them. But the church, the Roman Church, said we can forgive even those people who did such a terrible thing as betray
Yes, they
Christ.
had they had a lot of they had a lot of disagreement with Rome, and they were heretics.
Yeah,
And
but
tell us
but
about this great theologian.
well, Benedict XVI cited him at some length in a talk in 2009, and a week later went and took off his pallium and left it in Aquila. And the thing that Tychonius said, his great subject was the book of Revelation, the last things. And he said there are not just two groups in the world, the church and the world, or the Christians and the non-Christians, or the followers of Christ and of Antichrist. No, he said there's a division in the church itself between the followers of Christ and those who apostatize and leave.
Yes, who
And
would disagree with that?
well, some people are saying that when Benedict resigned his papacy in 2013, he'd been Pope from 2005 to 2013. February 11th, he announced, "I'm resigning." He lived another 10 years, and he went to the Vatican Gardens. He didn't leave and go back to Germany, and he still wore his white robe, and he said, "I'm going to be continuing my ministry, but it's no longer the Petrine aspect of the ministry, but the Johannine aspect. I'll continue it in prayer." So some people are saying he was mystically giving the signal that he was trying to retain his fidelity to Christ and to God inside the church, not to leave the church, but to leave that aspect of his mission, which had become impossible for him to continue because of so many people taking the papers right off his desk and giving them out to the journalists and Valley Leaks, saying to him, and one Monsignor once said to me that he sometimes would revise a text that Benedict had prepared to save the Pope from himself. In other words, the Pope was so conservative and orthodox that he tried to soften certain passages. Unbelievable things were happening inside the Vatican, as they are right now again. But Benedict made the decision to stay in the Vatican gardens and pray for 10 years, as if there was a kind of beam of light from him up to God that retained its validity and power all during the pontificate of Pope Francis. Well, anyway, he was basing in part on Tychonius's thesis that there's a division in the fidelity of Christians inside the body of Christ itself. All right. We've tried to...
I guess. How are you relating that to Malachi Martin?
Malachi was revealing to us, to mature our understanding of the attack that's hammering on the doors, on the windows, in the foundations, and on the roof of the church. All of the subtle and not so subtle temptations and accusations and suggestions that the media proposes, the universities propose, the people who try to reinterpret the scriptures in a new way. This struggle is so profound that we are called to be profound ourselves in our reaction. And by writing his books, he led us into the sort of engine room of the church and showed us that even there are battles occurring, so that therefore we ourselves should, through things like we're writing or these podcasts, using our reason and using our commitment to stay in continuity with our forefathers, should be aware that we're taking up the great battle that John Paul was trying to carry out against many obstacles, that Benedict was trying to carry out, Joseph Ratzinger, and that he himself was trying to carry out during his long and productive life. So we're going to come to... Well,
I guess, but yes, where does that take us?
Well, we're doing this pilgrimage to come see you as we do this podcast, and we're going to try to create in southern Spain a space of retreat and reflection, and receive from you the wisdom and the grace.
The wisdom and the grace through me. That'll be an accident, Robert. No. We'll give what we can and toward the spiritual betterment. But I just to conclude this on Malachi Martin, I really think that in a great way he was a prophet, and I think that what he was concerned about very much was exactly what is happening today. Exactly what is happening today. He saw that things were going in this direction, even when I didn't see that. Certainly with Pope John Paul II, I didn't see it. With Pope Benedict, I was extremely hopeful that things were going to get back on track. And then all of a sudden, but Malachi, he seemed to know that. He knew that. And I think all of his writing was a preparation for people to come to understand what was happening, that they would be on the right side of things when this happened.
Right.
That's my take anyway.
Well, thanks for hearing our program. Please like us and tell other people about us. It would help us. Consider subscribing to our magazine, Inside the Vatican, InsideTheVatican.com on the internet. Consider joining a pilgrimage to a retreat in southern Spain with Father Murr. And you can find more information about that at Inside the Vatican Pilgrimages. And continue to watch this program. We're going to try to continue forward, make it better, and build our community. Lady Rotha is here. Thank you, gentlemen, she says. We thank you, Lady Rotha.
And all our listeners. Absolutely. Thank you, Robert. See you next week. Same time, same station?
Same time, same station.
God bless.